Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. And in this video I'm going to be looking at some late war German armour with something that's been in my pile of shame for a long time. In this video we're going to be painting the Elefant from Warlord Games. This is for the bolt action range. This is a resin miniature. I think they still sell this resin miniature, but it now comes with all the little extras and gubbins that they put into their kits. I did this a few years ago. You can see here I've put some mesh on the side. That mesh is actually just a bandage that I've stretched out. Put it on with PVA glue. I've also put some of the resin stuff on there to be some mud and battle damage, and the crew members you see sat on there are actually the two Michael Wittmann crew members from the special edition Tiger tank that Warlord Games do. I'm going to base this loosely on a late war kind of colour scheme that I've found and seen in a lot of vehicles. I'm not going to be putting on the Balkan crews or like the transfers, that kind of thing. Not really doing that. It's going to be a basic, generic, late war German colour scheme. I'm really kind of getting myself back into bolt action, clearing some of the pile of shame because I'm looking forward to 3rd edition coming out, so obviously in kind of September. So this will be a great technique for painting up your German late war tanks really quick. It's super easy using a very limited palette of paints. So the first one we're doing here, we're dropping on a middle stone from Vallejo Games. Now, you can see here I'm not dry brushing. Might look like it, but when you see there, I am leaving the sort of gaps and cracks and the black kind of showing through from the black undercoat that I've done, but it's a bit more paint on the brush than a traditional dry brush. So yes, I am building up into thinner layers, but it's not a traditional dry brush. Now this bit is a traditional dry brush though. Whilst working on the armour panels and layering on that paint, when the brush gets very, very nearly to dry, what I'm doing is I'm literally dry brushing over the crew members as well. That's going to help with how I'm going to do their clothing later on. Again, this is a fast scheme and this is a technique to speed up some of the paints we're going to use later. So we're now through all the armour, and I moved on really to the camouflage stripes now. So obviously the schemes I'm looking at uses sort of a brown and green camouflage over that kind of middle stone base. Now I started by putting it on just with a normal brush. Really wasn't happy with how it looked, so I thought, right, before I do any more, I'm not happy, I'll move on. Now what I'm doing now is stippling on that armour. So this kind of gives a similar effect to what you might get by using like an airbrush or something, which I don't tend to do very often for painting stuff. I do have one for base coating, but I don't really use it. So what I've done there, you can see, is this is an old brush. At the end has been cut off, so it's quite a stubby brush. And I'm literally dipping the paint into the end of, dipping the brush into the end of the paint, and then stabbing it onto the model. Now you can see I'm not putting loads and loads of paint on this brush. You can see here I started stippling. Not enough came off in my mind, so I went back into the paint. Now the advantage of it stippling is it kind of spreads the paint out a little bit. It doesn't give those kind of harsh, obvious lines that make it look like it's been painted by a brush, because in reality this was camouflage was put on by people with either at the end of a mop or literally, you know, a broom. They scrubbed this paint on, or they might have done it with a roller, so it wouldn't have been pristine kind of lines. So we're doing that in a stippling fashion. Now moving on to the reflective green, which is the other part of the late war German camouflage, and again stippling this on. Now if you notice what I've done with the brown bits, I've kind of done stripes, but in kind of S's and C's and little swirly patterns there, really going off that reference picture that I found and seeing what a lot of tanks, you know, in museums and stuff, or World of Tanks, you play that computer game, kind of following the sort of real camouflage schemes there. Now when you go with the green though, what you're trying to do is fill in that space a little bit more. So you'll see that I'm doing little odd shapes there to fill it in. I'm doing some larger blocky areas of green. That seems to be what the colour scheme was done. Now whilst this is loosely based off a historical colour scheme, it is not an exact colour scheme for an exact unit at any kind of time. So, you know, bear that sort of caveat in mind. This is about getting your stuff done fast on the battlefield in a recognisable colour scheme without it being an exact unit type. Now what I'm doing now with a really, really big fat makeup brush is a very, very light dry brush of that bone white across the entirety of the model. There is virtually no paint coming off this brush when I'm doing this, so, you know, be very careful. If you're not confident in a dry brushing, probably not a step for yourself, but a really light dusting of that bone white across the whole model. It kind of knocks the colours down a little bit, it dusts up the model so it looks like there's a bit of sort of dust on the vehicle, and it puts some highlight edging on all the armour panels in a colour that's just off the base colour scheme of here. Now, painting the camo net, again, not dry brushing, kind of wet brushing, but you're not putting tons and tons of paint down. I'm using the edge of a makeup brush here to hit just the webbing of this net that I've put on. We're not pushing the paint downwards, we're moving the brush across and letting the edges of the bristles just drop the paint onto the fibres of the bandage that we put on there. And you can see there, it's picking it up onto the fibres and it's not going through to that base colour that's underneath this webbing. Now it's not a massive problem if it does. Well, I'd say if it does, get your old brush, go for the base colours again, and then just very gently going between the weave of the kind of webbing from the bandage we've done. Now, all I'm doing now is going back to the reflective green and doing, again, a light dry brush in this case over the kind of colours, just to put a few different colours into that kind of bandage that we've done on there and make that camo net look a little bit more interesting. Now, all the colours I've used are going to be at the top left of the screen, you see popping up here. Again, this is just my interpretation of a late war German camo scheme, although it is taking off a few popular ones that I've seen either in manuals or whatever. So now it's about the metallics. There's not a huge amount of metallics on the model, and I'm consciously not painting some of the parts I could paint metallic because I want to leave it quite subtle. So doing the tracks, and when it comes to here where you've got the grills over the engine deck, I'm actually not painting every last part of the grill. I'm just very gently going across and putting patches of this painting, because when I've seen real armour in museums and whatever, yes, they paint the engine grills anyway, the colour of the tank, but then bits of that will wear off because when they're doing maintenance they tread on the grill or the heat strips the paint off, so just a slight effect there. Now moving on to a different style of paint, this is the first sort of non-Vallejo paint we're using. This is Games Workshop Contrast Paint Black Legion. This is a speed paint. I use the Games Workshop one, but any company's kind of speed paint would be perfectly workable. Advantage of this, we're going to very quickly go over the uniform, the hats, even the hair, that kind of thing. And that dusty layer of Middlestone that we dry brushed over will give all the highlights that we need on the kind of uniform, and we won't be doing any extra stages on the uniform with this, keeping it very, very simple. And it is quite subtle, this paint, so on this film you can't really see the highlight layers it's given, but it has. Now moving on to the flesh, so we're going to work on the tank crewman very quickly, not going into a super level of detail, but taking just a basic flat flesh colour, hands and faces, with a nice sort of layer of paint on there to clear that out. And again, not a massive level of detail, using the paints we've already used. So I'm taking on that flat flesh colour that we use for the camo and putting that onto the bands or the strap he's got round for his binoculars, taking an off-white colour to go onto the markings that are on the uniform. So these is obviously the pin badges and the stitched on details, and we're just going to do off-white. Now in reality there were a number of colours that would have been used on, you know, these kind of details, but on a miniature this kind of size I think it must slight overkill to do that. And if you saw in the background there, that model stood on my desk was the Bavarian from the Kelly's Hero set that I painted recently, just giving myself a bit of reference. Now it's time to sort of do some slight dirtying up of the vehicle. So this is a Vallejo Beastie Brown. I do a lot of my mud colours in that sense. And all I'm doing at this point is I'm just painting the areas where I've put on that Vallejo kind of putty medium ground cover stuff that I used at the very beginning that you would have seen when the model was in its resin state. So we're not putting dirt on the rest of the tracks and stuff yet. Now, very final stages, there's some detail to do after this, but essentially this is the scheme kind of done. I'm taking a Seraphim sepia wash. Now I quite often use a Vallejo wash, which is kind of a really dirty, dark kind of sepia wash. I want it a bit lighter this time. I don't want to take away from too much of the work I've done. So we're using the Games Workshop sepia shade. So really any sepia shade at this stage would do. All I would say is I use a really two main sepia shades, the Games Workshop one and a Vallejo one. The Vallejo one I use is the dip wash formula. It is a much, much dirtier formula and I absolutely love it and would traditionally use it on most models, but I didn't want it to be too dirty once it had dried. So we see here when it's dried there is a slight shine to it, which we'll take away later with a matte varnish, but essentially the model is done. All I want to do at this stage is some finishing details on the crew, because as much as the crew are not the focus on the model, you can see that people will look at that crew. So a little bit more detail on the faces. So I'm taking the same colours we've already used, the flat flesh, which now when the sepia wash has gone over it's been darkened down a little. So a slight highlight onto the flesh, nothing too detailed. And obviously you've got to do some eyes. I don't like painting eyes. I quite often don't bother doing it because from a distance when you're playing with them on a tabletop you can't see them, but this is a tank that I think people are going to pick up and have a look. So a little bit of white into the eyes, then when the white's dried a little, taking a bit of black and putting a black dot into the eyes is really, as you know, fairly easy way of doing it. Puts a little bit more detail on, and then a little bit of the red that we used for the medals and stuff that's on the chest. So a little bit of that onto the lips, just to put a slight bit of detail in there, make it feel like you've done a little bit more than you might do. And here's a bit of a close-up shot of dropping that dot of black into the eyes, and that's all we're really going to do on the crew. You could at this point, if you wanted, do some highlight layers onto the black and everything, but I'm not going to bother with that because I think actually the contrast paint we use has done a good job. Now, talked before, I've put the Beastie Brown onto those resin areas where we've got that resin kind of dirt. Now this is a super light dry brush of that Beastie Brown. Really very little paint coming off here. You can see it's hardly building up at all on the tracks, but this is to put that kind of dusty muck effect idea kicking up over the tracks and up onto the back of the tank and everything. Now you could go heavier, you could do 3 or 4 layers of this dry brushing, you could really mucky the tank up, but I just want to represent the dirt and muck that is going on there. Now you can see it's showing out on the silver there on the tracks how much is coming off, so not a huge amount coming off on there, and I knock it up so it's coming up to the back of the vehicle and kind of those areas where I've put the mud, so really kind of dirty it up. Now this is the model after it's had a matte varnish spray, so you can see not picking up as much light and stuff, although it is under quite a harsh light on this one. Really quite happy with this, how this has come out. So this has made it what I think is a nice quick way of getting your German armour onto the tabletop without having to use airbrushes and those kind of things that a lot of people use. This took me 3 days. Did this after coming back off holiday, so really sort of 3 evenings of painting, so maybe about 6 hours of work, which I don't think is too bad for a tank, with some extra bits on like the meshing and obviously the crewman as well. If you didn't have the camo net on, you didn't have the crew on, but even quicker, you could probably knock this out in 2-3 hours. So hope you like that colour scheme. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, and hopefully I will see you on the channel again.